The stadium lights blaze. The flags flutter. Cameras from across the world lock their lenses on one man. The man who built the Invictus Games into a global stage of resilience and courage. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, once hailed as the soldier prince with a heart for the wounded warriors, now finds himself at the center of a storm that no veteran, no competitor, and no royal supporter saw coming. The question hanging heavy in the air is not about medals, victories, or even the sacrifices of the service members who gave their blood and spirit on the battlefield. Instead, the story is about one demand, a demand that would ignite fierce arguments, divide public opinion, and once again drag Harry's name across the tabloids: his request for a private jet. It sounds trivial at first glance. A private jet for a prince hardly feels surprising. For decades, royals have traveled in opulence, cocooned in privilege that most people cannot imagine. But here, within the fragile ecosystem of the Invictus Games, where veterans walk into arenas carrying prosthetics, scars, and memories of war, Harry's request struck a different chord. It wasn't just a flight. It was a statement. And when the CEO of the Invictus Games reportedly said no, a firestorm began brewing that would shake the very foundations of Harry's carefully guarded legacy. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story begins with a contradiction that has followed Harry like a shadow. On the one hand, he is a man who has spoken loudly about climate change, sustainability, and the duty of global citizens to reduce their carbon footprint. He has stood at podiums, looked into cameras, and spoken with conviction about the dangers of excessive luxury and reckless carbon use. Yet at the same time, he has been photographed climbing into private jets with Meghan, even for trips as short as a few hundred miles. The contradiction has earned him the nickname Hypocrite Harry in certain corners of the press. And now, just as the Invictus Games prepare for their next major international event, that contradiction has risen again in a way that could no longer be brushed aside. Harry, in his vision, saw the private jet as more than a luxury. He believed it was necessary, insiders claim, to protect his time, his image, and even his security. Traveling commercial, he feared, could expose him to paparazzi ambushes, unwanted stares, and even security threats. For Meghan, who has always placed image at the forefront, the thought of arriving to the Games without grandeur seemed unimaginable. But the Invictus Games were not built for grandeur. They were built for grit. They were built for soldiers who learned to fight battles most civilians cannot comprehend. Rehabilitation, mental health, and survival after devastating wounds. So when the CEO reportedly said no, the tension snapped like a taut wire. Think about it for a moment. A project Harry once described as the one thing he would never let fail, suddenly standing on the edge of controversy not because of a lack of funding, not because of logistical chaos, but because of Harry himself. For the CEO, the denial was rooted in principle. Invictus funds, raised painstakingly through donors, sponsors, and governments, could not be drained to ferry a prince across the sky in ultimate comfort. It would be a betrayal of the veterans who stood as the face of the Games. Every dollar mattered, every decision scrutinized, and every appearance weighed against the values the Games claimed to uphold. And so the CEO drew a line. Harry, according to whispers from insiders, was livid. The denial cut deeper than the words themselves. To Harry, it was not just about a flight. It was about power. For years, Invictus had been branded as Harry's Games. He was the founder, the visionary, the royal face that opened doors. To be denied by the very organization he believed he owned in spirit felt like humiliation. It raised an uncomfortable question. Was Harry still the leader of the Invictus Games, or had the Games outgrown him? The middle of this drama is where the real weight lies. Because once the denial leaked, it was no longer just a dispute within the walls of Invictus. The press caught hold of the story, as they always do. And in an instant, the headlines shifted from celebrating the resilience of veterans to tearing apart Harry's character. Words like entitlement, arrogance, and hypocrisy filled the pages. The optics could not have been worse. How do you reconcile a prince demanding luxury travel with amputees struggling just to walk onto the field? How do you defend Harry's fury when the very Games he founded were supposed to be about humility and sacrifice? For Harry, the anger reportedly turned into pressure. Calls were made, allies rallied, and Meghan's voice added fuel to the fire. Some accounts suggest she urged him to stand his ground, to demand what he deserved as the face of the event. Others claim she feared humiliation if he were to be seen waiting in an airport lounge like an ordinary traveler. Whatever the truth, the couple's frustration grew. But the CEO would not budge. The games were bigger than one man, even if that man was a prince. This is the crux of the conflict. In the early days of Invictus, Harry was untouchable. He was the royal soldier who walked with veterans, who understood their pain, who cried with them in hospital wards. But over time, the Harry who once embodied sacrifice began to be seen, at least by critics, as a man more obsessed with control and comfort. The denial of the private jet was not just about travel. It was a symbol of Invictus shifting away from Harry's grip toward an organization answerable to its participants and supporters rather than its founder. And that symbolism, more than anything, is what ignited Harry's rage. As the introduction to this story draws toward its close, the stakes have been set. This is not just about planes or money. It is about identity, control, and the collision between principle and privilege. The Invictus Games, meant to stand as Harry's shining contribution to the world, now stand on the edge of a scandal that could stain their reputation forever. And yet, this is only the beginning. Because behind the denial lies a tangle of voices, veterans, royals, donors, the public, all waiting to weigh in. Some will defend Harry, painting him as a man trapped between duty and security. Others will condemn him, seeing the demand as proof that he has lost touch with the very values he once championed. When the Invictus Games were first conceived, they were not born out of luxury, controversy, or image management. They were born out of pain, resilience, and a soldier's unshakable bond with those who served alongside him. Prince Harry, once the spare prince whose life often seemed defined by what he was not, found in the Invictus Games a purpose that made him stand apart. Long before the arguments over jets, budgets, and optics, Harry was a man haunted by war, seeking redemption through a project that gave back to those he saw as his brothers and sisters in arms. The origins trace back to Harry's own military service. He had walked among soldiers in Afghanistan, felt the heat of combat, and witnessed firsthand the toll of war. He was not an outsider in a palace tower looking down at troops from afar, at least not during those years. He knew what it meant to sit in a mess hall, to share jokes under the weight of fatigue, to grieve when comrades did not return. But perhaps most importantly, he had seen what happened to those who came back broken. The veterans missing limbs, the ones struggling to climb out of the pit of trauma, the men and women whose bodies became permanent reminders of the battlefield. It was in 2013, during a trip to the Warrior Games in the United States, that Harry found the spark. The Warrior Games, organized by the U.S. Department of Defense, showcased wounded, ill, and injured service members competing in adaptive sports. Harry sat in the stands, watching men with prosthetic legs run on tracks, women who had lost their eyesight compete with precision, and soldiers who had nearly lost everything fight for a new form of victory. The experience moved him deeply. He realized that sports could be more than a pastime. It could be a path back to dignity, to healing, to identity for those who had given so much in uniform. But Harry's vision wasn't just to replicate what he had seen. He wanted something bigger, something international, something that carried the weight of a global platform. With his royal name, his military background, and his growing reputation as a figure willing to break molds, he began to build the foundations of what would become the Invictus Games. The very name, Invictus, meaning unconquered, was chosen deliberately. It symbolized not victory in the traditional sense, but resilience, the refusal to be broken by circumstance, the ability to rise even when the body and mind carried scars. The first Invictus Games took place in London in 2014. The city buzzed with anticipation as veterans from across the world came together not just to compete, but to tell their stories. It wasn't about medals alone. It was about reclaiming identity. For many, this was the first time they were seen not as victims of war, but as athletes, competitors, warriors who had not been conquered by fate. Harry was front and center, visible not as a detached royal, but as a participant in spirit, cheering in the stands, hugging competitors, listening to their stories with tears in his eyes. He was not there to lecture, but to share the stage. And in those moments, the world saw Harry at his best. The birth of Invictus was also the birth of Harry's true legacy, separate from the monarchy. The royal family had long been associated with patronages, ribbon cuttings, and charity events, but Harry wanted something more visceral, more personal. He wanted to build something that would last decades, something that would make him relevant not as a royal by birth, but as a man by choice. The Invictus Games quickly grew into a symbol of hope. Governments pledged support, celebrities offered endorsements, and veterans across the globe rallied behind the idea. Suddenly, Harry was not just a prince. He was a leader of a movement. Yet even in the beginning, there were hints of tension. Critics wondered if Harry's vision was sustainable, if the costs would outweigh the benefits, if his involvement was more about personal redemption than altruism. The games were expensive, requiring enormous funding, sponsorships, and logistical coordination. But for the veterans, none of that mattered. They were given a stage, a voice, and a chance to reclaim the spotlight in a way that said, "We are still here. We are still strong. We are not done." For Harry, the success of the first games was a vindication. All his doubts, his internal struggles, the whispers of whether he was capable of building something beyond his title, all of it faded as he stood on that stage in London. The applause was not for the prince. It was for the games, for the athletes, for the idea that brokenness could coexist with strength. But Harry absorbed some of that applause as validation. He had found his purpose. In the years that followed, the Invictus Games traveled the globe. Orlando in 2016, Toronto in 2017, Sydney in 2018, The Hague in 2022. Each edition brought new stories, new heroes, new tears, and new triumphs. And with each passing year, Harry's association with the games deepened. He was no longer simply their founder, he was their emblem. The games became shorthand for Harry's character, a counterbalance to the negative press he often endured. When critics mocked his privileges, defenders pointed to Invictus. When tabloids questioned his choices, supporters reminded them of the soldiers he stood beside. The games shielded him, gave him credibility, and kept his name tied to something noble. This chapter of the story is crucial because it lays the foundation for why the private jet scandal cuts so deeply. The games were built on sacrifice, humility, and the image of a prince who had shed his entitlement to walk alongside veterans. That was the promise. That was the dream. And for years, it worked. Harry was untouchable within the Invictus sphere. His authenticity seemed unquestionable. But beneath the surface, the pressures mounted. Funding the games became harder as global economies shifted. Donor fatigue set in. Organizers wrestled with the balance between spectacle and sustainability. And Harry himself began to evolve, or, as some critics argue, unravel. His marriage, his departure from royal duties, his battles with the press, all of it began to bleed into his association with Invictus. Suddenly, the games were no longer just about the athletes. They were about Harry too, about his struggles, his image, his need to remain relevant on the world stage. The birth of Invictus is a story of vision, heart, and redemption. But it also planted the seeds of expectation. When you build something on values like sacrifice and humility, every choice you make thereafter is measured against those values. And when the man who once embodied the spirit of Invictus is seen demanding privilege that contradicts its ethos, the fallout is not just personal, it is existential. The contradiction in Prince Harry's life has always been stark. On one side, he has presented himself as the soldier prince, the grounded royal who walked among ordinary troops and who shed the trappings of privilege to fight for a cause greater than himself. On the other, he has been a man steeped in luxury, born into palaces, accustomed to chauffeur-driven cars, and later, reliant on private jets that symbolize not just wealth, but detachment from ordinary life. This tension between humility and extravagance is one of the most defining elements of Harry's public image. It is also one of the reasons why his request for a private jet to the Invictus Games became so explosive. To understand why the refusal hit so hard, one must first understand Harry's long and complicated relationship with luxury. Harry was born into a world where luxury was not an option, but a default. From the moment he opened his eyes in St. Mary's Hospital in 1984, his life was set apart. His nursery was not ordinary. His clothes were not off the rack. His first steps were taken under the gaze of cameras. While his mother, Princess Diana, famously tried to give her sons a taste of normal life, taking them to McDonald's, standing with them in queues at theme parks, or letting them sit in economy on certain flights, it was still clear that Harry's life would never be ordinary. The contrast between Diana's attempts at normalcy and the rigid structures of the monarchy created an environment where Harry experienced glimpses of both worlds, the grounded and the gilded. As a young boy, he spent holidays at Balmoral and Sandringham, surrounded by sprawling estates, sprawling feasts, and staff who anticipated every need. His clothes were pressed, his toys expensive, his movements protected by security. Yet he also saw his mother's tears, her desire to show him a different path, her insistence that he should understand what life was like beyond palace walls. This duality shaped Harry. It gave him the sense that he could move between worlds, that he could be both prince and person. But it also embedded within him an expectation. Luxury would always be within reach. This expectation carried into adulthood. His military service gave him a taste of grit, discipline, and hardship, but it was always buffered by the fact that he was a royal. He served in combat zones, yes, but his security was paramount. His accommodations were better than most. And when his service ended, the comforts of royal life remained waiting. When Harry left the army, he did not step into obscurity or financial struggle. He stepped into engagements, charity galas, and royal tours where luxury was threaded into the fabric of daily existence. Over time, one symbol of this reliance on luxury became particularly damaging: the private jet. While commercial flights represent the experiences of ordinary travelers, crowded lines, delays, baggage checks, private jets are the opposite. They are sleek, exclusive, efficient, and above all, symbols of status. For Harry and Meghan, they became a lifeline, a way to move from one country to another without enduring the chaos of airports or the scrutiny of paparazzi. The argument was always the same: security. The couple insisted that flying commercial placed them at risk, exposing them to photographers, potential threats, and unwanted attention. But no matter how valid the argument might have been, the optics were disastrous. The world saw a man who delivered speeches about climate change and the need for environmental responsibility while boarding jets that emitted massive amounts of carbon. Critics seized on the hypocrisy. Tabloids labeled him a fraud, activists questioned his sincerity, and memes mocked his contradictions. One headline, "After Harry and Meghan took 4 private flights in 11 days, declared, 'Harry the hypocrite.' It stung, but the pattern persisted. For Harry, private jets became more than a convenience. They became a necessity, woven into his lifestyle and justified by his sense of vulnerability. This dependence deepened after Harry and Meghan left royal life in 2020. No longer shielded by the institution, they leaned harder into the narrative of needing absolute control over their appearances and movements. Luxury became their fortress. Their California mansion, sprawling with acres of land and complete with security gates, became another symbol of that dependence. Their wardrobes, cars, and vacations reflected not a departure from privilege, but an evolution into a new kind of celebrity luxury, one less tied to royal tradition, but equally steeped in exclusivity. The tension, however, was not just about the optics. It was about the contradiction between Harry's identity as the founder of the Invictus Games and his reliance on luxuries that contradicted the very spirit of the event. The veterans who competed in Invictus knew hardship intimately. They had faced long waits at military hospitals, endured months of physical therapy, navigated bureaucratic red tape, and fought for recognition. Their lives were defined by sacrifice. For them, the games were not about spectacle but survival. To see the founder demand a private jet, therefore, struck at the very heart of the ethos they represented. It was not merely about transportation. It was about values. Harry's relationship with luxury has also been shaped by Meghan. From the earliest days of their relationship, Meghan was seen as someone who valued image and presentation. She came from Hollywood, a world where appearances mattered, where travel was about red carpets and exclusivity. Together, the couple cultivated a brand that thrived on curated appearances. Whether it was their Oprah interview staged against a carefully chosen California backdrop, or their highly orchestrated Netflix series, Their public moments often exuded polish and control. Luxury, in this context, was not accidental. It was essential. This is why Harry's request for a private jet to the Invictus Games carried so much weight. It was not an isolated demand. It was part of a pattern that had defined his recent years. It tied into his larger identity crisis. Was he still the soldier prince who walked shoulder to shoulder with veterans, or was he now the celebrity duke who demanded privileges even at the cost of principle? That tension lies at the core of the scandal. As we look at Harry's relationship with luxury, it becomes clear why the denial hurt so deeply. The private jet was not just a vehicle. It was a symbol of control, of protection, of the life Harry and Meghan have built outside the monarchy. Being denied that luxury by the CEO of the Games was not just a logistical inconvenience. It was a reminder that Harry could not bend every institution to his will. It was a reminder that there were limits to his influence, even in the very project he had created. And for a man who has long equated luxury with safety and dignity, that denial felt like a wound. The request came quietly at first, like so many behind-the-scenes negotiations that rarely make the public eye. Prince Harry, preparing for the upcoming Invictus Games, reached out through his team with what seemed to him a reasonable demand: secure a private jet for his travel. To Harry, this wasn't framed as a luxury, but as a necessity. His argument was layered with concerns about security, efficiency, and dignity. For a man who had spent years hounded by paparazzi, vilified by tabloids, and portrayed as both a victim and a villain in equal measure, the thought of walking through a crowded commercial airport was unthinkable. But what he saw as a precaution, others within the Invictus organization saw as a provocation. The mechanics of the request were telling. Harry's team outlined the expectation in clear terms, emphasizing that commercial travel posed unacceptable risks. They pointed to his past security concerns in the UK, where he has fought public battles for government-provided protection. They argued that Harry's presence at the Games was not simply ceremonial, it was central. His arrival, his image, and his speeches brought global attention. For that reason, they insisted, ensuring his comfort and safety through private air travel was justified. What Harry did not anticipate was that the request would ignite a quiet but fierce resistance within the very organization he founded. To understand why, we must consider the delicate ecosystem of the Invictus Games. Unlike royal tours or celebrity galas, the Games are funded not by state coffers or Hollywood studios, but by a fragile mix of sponsorships, donations, and partnerships with governments. Every dollar is scrutinized, every allocation debated. The Games are designed to serve wounded veterans and their families, providing rehabilitation through sport and visibility for their struggles. In that world, extravagance is not just frowned upon, it is dangerous. Donors want to believe their money is going to athletes, equipment, therapy, and events that genuinely uplift veterans, not to fund the luxuries of a prince who, by all accounts, already lives in wealth. The request for a private jet, then, carried a symbolic weight that went beyond logistics. For Invictus organizers, it was a direct test of their principles. Could they justify spending, or even reallocating funds or asking sponsors to provide a jet for Harry while amputees trained tirelessly to afford prosthetics? Could they explain to governments and charities that while they budgeted every penny for athletes' care, they had spared none to indulge Harry's wish for a luxury flight? The optics alone would be catastrophic. And so, when the CEO was informed of the request, the answer was swift and resolute: no. But the refusal was not delivered coldly. According to insiders, the CEO explained the decision with firm but respectful reasoning. The Invictus Games were about sacrifice, resilience, and equality. Every athlete, every family member, and every volunteer who attended did so with humility. The Games could not become a platform for excess, not even for the man who created them. To grant Harry this request would unravel the very image that kept Invictus alive. It would be a betrayal of values. For Harry, the refusal struck a nerve. This was not the first time he had faced limits on his influence, but it was perhaps the most personal. Invictus was his creation, his crowning achievement, the one project that had always been described as Harry's Games. He had poured his heart into it, defended it, and wielded it as proof that he was more than a spare prince. To hear no from the CEO of his own project felt like a challenge to his authority, almost like a betrayal. In private, he raged. Accounts from insiders describe him as stunned, angered, even humiliated. The man who had once stood as the unquestioned leader of Invictus now felt sidelined within it. Why did Harry see the jet as so essential? Part of the answer lies in optics. He and Meghan had cultivated a brand rooted in exclusivity and polish. Their arrival at any event was expected to be carefully managed, staged almost like a production. For Harry, walking through an airport concourse surrounded by strangers was not just a security risk, it was an image risk. A photograph of him standing at a check-in counter, juggling luggage, or being mobbed by cameras would have been circulated globally within minutes. In his mind, the games required his arrival to match the grandeur of his image. A prince stepping out of a sleek private aircraft, walking with authority onto the tarmac, waving to cameras with controlled confidence. Anything less risked humiliation. Meghan's influence also loomed large. Her instincts as an actress and media-savvy figure leaned toward control. She understood the power of optics, the way a single image could define a narrative. For her, the thought of Harry arriving in ordinary fashion undermined the story they wanted to tell about themselves. It made the demand for the jet even more urgent. To Harry and Meghan, this was not a frivolous request. It was about safeguarding their brand. Yet what Harry and Meghan framed as necessity, others saw as entitlement. This tension between perception and principle is where the conflict sharpened. For veterans preparing to compete, the games were not about luxury or image. They were about reclaiming dignity through sweat, discipline, and perseverance. For organizers, every decision was tied to maintaining credibility with the public and donors. To bend the rules for Harry would risk turning the games from a platform of resilience into a spectacle of hypocrisy. The private jet request, then, was not just a logistical issue. It was a moral one. It forced the game's leadership to make a choice between appeasing their founder or upholding their principles. And when they chose principle, they sent a message not just to Harry but to the world. Invictus would not be hijacked by personal privilege. For Harry, that message was devastating. It was as if the organization he built had turned against him. The denial felt like rejection, like an attack on his identity. It reignited old wounds. His perception of being sidelined by his family, his struggle to assert independence, his constant battle for respect in a world that often mocked or dismissed him. The private jet request was supposed to be a simple matter, resolved with ease. Instead, it became the spark for a wider scandal, one that would expose Harry's contradictions, test his leadership, and challenge the very foundation of the Invictus Games. The request had been made. The discussions were carried out through aides, emails, and quiet meetings that were never supposed to see the light of day. But when the CEO of the Invictus Games received Prince Harry's demand for a private jet, the response was not hesitation, not delay, but a clear and decisive refusal. For the CEO, this was not about who Harry was, or what his title once meant. It was about the very survival of the games and the values on which they were built. The denial was firm, and it was deliberate. The reasoning was straightforward but powerful. Invictus was never designed to be a playground of privilege. From its inception, it carried the ethos of sacrifice, humility, and grit. The veterans who competed were not celebrities seeking glamour. They were warriors fighting for dignity and healing. To divert funds, sponsorships, or partnerships to satisfy a luxury request from Harry would betray that ethos in the most glaring way possible. The CEO knew this. Every sponsor was watching. Every government partner was calculating. Every veteran who had been promised respect and fairness was depending on the leadership to keep the games free from corruption or excess. The financial argument alone was compelling. Private jet travel for someone of Harry's status could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on distance and arrangements. The Invictus Games, already under strain from balancing budgets for venues, medical support, accommodations for athletes, and logistics, could not justify such an expense. Every dollar spent on luxury would be a dollar not spent on rehabilitation programs, prosthetics, transportation for athletes, or facilities designed to make the competition accessible. For the CEO, the choice was clear. Harry's request was a diversion of mission-critical resources. And the answer was no. But this was not just about money. It was about optics. The CEO understood that perception was as powerful as reality. What would the public say if they learned that the founder of the games, who spoke so passionately about sacrifice and equality, had demanded a private jet while veterans made do with economy flights and shared buses? The backlash would be swift, merciless, and devastating. Tabloids would feast on the contradiction, donors would reconsider their commitments, and governments would quietly pull back support. To protect Harry by indulging his request would, paradoxically, destroy him. The CEO refused not just to protect the games, but to protect Harry from himself. Still, the refusal was not delivered lightly. According to those close to the situation, the CEO communicated the decision with respect, careful to emphasize that the denial was rooted in principle, not personal animosity. The message was firm but polite. The games must remain about the athletes, the veterans, and the unconquered spirit they embodied. It could not be overshadowed by demands that symbolized privilege. Harry, no matter how important his role, was not above the mission. For Harry, this response landed like a blow. To be denied by the CEO of his own project was deeply humiliating. Invictus had always been described as his games, the creation that proved he was more than a spare prince, more than a man defined by his title. Yet here was the CEO, a figure technically accountable to him, drawing boundaries that Harry could not cross. It raised a dangerous question. Was he still in charge? Or had Invictus grown into something bigger than him, something that no longer needed his approval for every decision? The CEO's refusal also highlighted an uncomfortable reality. Invictus was an organization now. It had boards, donors, and staff who were not beholden to Harry's whims. It was no longer the scrappy project he launched in London in 2014. It had matured into a global institution, accountable to the veterans it served and the public that supported it. In that sense, Harry's request was a test of whether the games would remain true to their mission or collapse under the weight of celebrity indulgence. The CEO chose mission. But if the refusal was firm, it was also a gamble. The CEO knew that angering Harry could have consequences. Harry was still the public face of the games. He was the one who brought media attention, secured royal goodwill in the early years, and drew celebrity endorsements. Alienating him risked damaging that public image. Yet the CEO calculated that the greater risk lay in indulging him. To say yes would compromise Invictus in the eyes of its most important supporters, the veterans and their families. Without their trust, the games would lose their heart. The refusal also carried symbolic power. It was a declaration that Invictus had matured beyond being Harry's project. It was an organization with its own authority, its own principles, and its own right to draw lines. For years, Harry had basked in the idea that the games were inseparable from his identity. But now, the CEO's firm stance suggested otherwise. Invictus could survive without indulgence to Harry. Perhaps, in time, it could even survive without Harry at all. Behind the scenes, the fallout began to ripple. Harry's aides, stunned by the denial, pressed for reconsideration. They argued the case again: security, image, necessity. But the CEO remained resolute. The refusal was final. The games would not fund or facilitate a private jet for Harry. If he wished to travel privately, he would need to pay for it himself. That condition, though simple in words, carried heavy weight. It implied that Harry, once seen as the soul of Invictus, was being treated like any other participant or guest. No exceptions, no indulgences. The tension was palpable. For Harry, the denial was more than a logistical inconvenience. It was a crack in his authority, a reminder that he was no longer untouchable. For the CEO, it was a statement of principle, a line in the sand. For the public, once the story leaked, it would become a symbol of the clash between privilege and principle. And for the veterans, it was reassurance that their sacrifices remained at the heart of the games. The refusal did not sit quietly with Harry. In fact, it struck him at his very core. For a man who had long prided himself on his role as the founder and face of the Invictus Games, being told no felt not just like a denial of a request, but an erosion of his authority. The moment the CEO's firm response reached him, those close to Harry say the atmosphere shifted immediately. Gone was the calm, composed figure who often spoke of resilience and humility. What emerged instead was a furious man, pacing, raising his voice, and venting about betrayal from within his own camp. Harry had always seen Invictus as more than just an event. It was his proof to the world that he was not the spare, not the failure, not the party prince who made mistakes in Vegas or wore ill-advised costumes. Invictus was his redemption story. And now, the one project that had shielded him from criticism was also the very place where his demands were denied. That contradiction was unbearable. To him, it was humiliating. If his authority could be challenged within Invictus, where else could he claim leadership? His fury spilled out in waves. Those in his circle reported him shouting about how the games would not even exist without him, how the CEO owed him loyalty, how the refusal was an insult not only to him, but to the very brand of Invictus. To Harry, this wasn't about a plane anymore. It was about respect. He saw the denial as proof that people were beginning to forget who had built the games, who had put his name and reputation on the line to bring them into existence. That stung deeply. The anger was compounded by Megan's influence. Megan, who had been by his side through years of battles with the press, lawsuits, and royal family disputes, reportedly encouraged him to push back hard. From her perspective, Harry's image was inseparable from the games. Any attempt to sideline him or deny him privileges was an attempt to weaken his role, and by extension, their joint brand. Megan reminded him that his presence at the games was not optional, it was central. Without Harry, the cameras would not come, the headlines would not roll, and the games would not have the same global impact. She viewed the CEO's refusal not as a matter of principle, but as a direct challenge to Harry's leadership. Harry, already raw from years of feeling diminished by his family and vilified by the press, absorbed Megan's words like fuel. The more he stewed on the denial, the more it became personal. His fury was not just about logistics, but about identity. Every time he replayed the refusal in his mind, he saw it as confirmation of a painful narrative, that no matter what he built, no matter what he gave, there would always be someone ready to undermine him. Behind closed doors, Harry reportedly threatened to reconsider his involvement in future games. It was a dramatic outburst, one that his advisors tried to temper. They reminded him that walking away from Invictus would be catastrophic for his reputation. The games were his strongest shield, the one arena where he was universally praised, even by critics of his personal life. Abandoning it in anger would not just hurt the games, it would destroy the last pillar of his credibility. Still, in the heat of his rage, Harry spoke of betrayal so deep that stepping back seemed tempting. The anger also revealed itself in subtle ways. Harry became more withdrawn in public appearances, his smiles tighter, his speeches laced with hints of frustration. He began to emphasize his personal ownership of the games more than ever, as if to reassert control. Every mention of Invictus became a reminder to the world. This was his creation, and no one should forget that. But those close to the games noticed the shift. The founder who once embodied humility and solidarity with veterans now seemed consumed with maintaining authority and image. His fury also leaked beyond private walls. Whispers of his outburst began to circulate. The press, always eager for scandal, caught wind of the dispute. Soon, stories emerged painting Harry as petulant, entitled, and furious at being denied luxury. Headlines accused him of hypocrisy, demanding extravagance while veterans flew commercial. Social media seized on the irony, with users mocking the man who preached about sacrifice yet demanded comfort. Memes of Harry boarding private jets flooded timelines, amplifying the narrative of hypocrisy. For Harry, already raw from the refusal, the public humiliation only deepened his rage. Yet beneath the anger was also fear. Harry feared that the denial was a sign of something larger, that his grip on Invictus was slipping. If the CEO could refuse him once, could they refuse him again? Could the games evolve into something that no longer needed him at all? That thought haunted him. His fury was as much about panic as it was about pride. Losing control of Invictus would mean losing the one legacy he had managed to build outside of the monarchy. Without it, what would define him? The furious reaction also drove a wedge between Harry and some within the game's leadership. Staff members who had once admired him began to whisper about his temper, about how the man who spoke of resilience was cracking under pressure. Veterans who had looked up to him began to question whether his focus was truly on them or on himself. The anger, while understandable in its context, risked eroding the trust he had spent years building. What makes this reaction so pivotal is that it was not contained. It was not a single outburst behind closed doors. It was a ripple that spread through Harry's inner circle, the Invictus organization, the press, and the public. His fury became a story of its own, feeding into the wider narrative of entitlement and hypocrisy. For Harry, it was the worst possible outcome. He had sought control through his request for a private jet. Instead, he ended up losing control of the narrative itself. When whispers of Harry's furious reaction began leaking into the public sphere, it was inevitable that the story would not remain confined to private circles. The media had always been relentless with him, dissecting every decision, every outburst, every contradiction. And so, when it was reported that Harry had lashed out after the Invictus CEO denied his private jet request, the reaction was swift, loud, and unforgiving. The tabloids in Britain seized the story with predictable relish. Headlines screamed hypocrisy, accusing the prince who once championed humility and sacrifice of demanding privileges no ordinary veteran would ever receive. Newspapers plastered images of Harry smiling with athletes at past games alongside photos of him stepping into private jets. The contrast was damning. On one side, soldiers missing limbs and showing grit on the track. On the other, Harry demanding luxury in the skies. The narrative was simple and brutal. The founder of the games had betrayed its spirit. In America, where Harry and Meghan had tried to craft a softer, more sympathetic brand, the coverage was mixed. Some outlets framed the denial as a misunderstanding, emphasizing Harry's concerns for safety and security. Others, however, pointed out the growing gap between his words and his actions. Commentators on talk shows mocked the irony of a man who left royal life for independence, only to still demand royal treatment wherever he went. The question they posed was biting. Had Harry really broken free of the monarchy, or had he simply traded one form of entitlement for another? On social media, the story exploded. Twitter and Instagram became battlegrounds where defenders and critics of Harry clashed. Supporters argued that as a high-profile figure constantly under threat, Harry had a right to prioritize safety. They pointed to his ongoing legal battles with the UK government over security funding, claiming the denial of a private jet was irresponsible given his risks. Critics, however, drowned out those voices with memes, satire, and condemnation. Posts mocked the idea of Invictus veterans boarding economy flights while their founder demanded private luxury. Some went further, framing Harry as the very embodiment of privilege gone unchecked. The veterans themselves, or at least those who spoke publicly, offered more nuanced perspectives. Some expressed sympathy, acknowledging that Harry's safety concerns were not entirely unfounded. Others, however, admitted disappointment. For them, Invictus had always been about equality, about leveling the playing field for those who had given everything. To see its founder demanding an exception for himself was, to them, disheartening. One veteran put it bluntly in an interview. "We don't compete for special treatment. We compete to prove we don't need it. If Harry can't stand alongside us without luxury, what does that say about what this is all about?" Those words resonated, cutting to the very heart of the issue. The public perception of Harry's anger was also shaped by timing. The world had grown weary of stories about privilege and hypocrisy from elites. In a time when ordinary people struggled with rising costs, economic instability, and social unrest, the idea of a prince raging over the denial of a private jet seemed almost grotesque. It reinforced the sense that Harry, despite his rhetoric of compassion and solidarity, was out of touch with the realities of those he claimed to serve. Even among royal watchers, who often split along lines of loyalty to Harry or the crown, the story caused discomfort. Those loyal to the monarchy saw it as vindication, proof that Harry's break from royal duties had only exposed his flaws. They pointed to his anger as evidence that he was ill-suited for leadership, unable to handle responsibility without resorting to entitlement. Those sympathetic to Harry struggled to defend him, often pivoting to arguments about his mental health, trauma, and the pressures of public life. But even then, the defense seemed thin against the sheer weight of the optics. Television coverage added fuel to the fire. Clips of Harry's past speeches about sacrifice and humility were replayed alongside commentary about the jet dispute. Analysts dissected every angle: the financial implications, the symbolic meaning, the damage to the Invictus brand. Some suggested that the games might suffer from donor fatigue if Harry's reputation continued to decline. Others speculated whether sponsors would distance themselves to avoid association with scandal. In these discussions, Harry's fury was not just a personal matter, but a liability to the institution he had built. Perhaps the most damaging perception, however, was the suggestion that Harry's anger revealed his true priorities. The public began to ask uncomfortable questions. Was Invictus really about veterans, or was it about Harry? Was the game's mission of resilience still at its core, or had it become a platform for him to maintain relevance and status? These questions struck at the very foundation of his legacy, and for many, the answers did not favor him. The ridicule grew sharper as the days went on. Late-night comedians made jokes about Harry being grounded like a teenager denied the car keys. Online critics called him Jetlag Harry, a mocking nod to his repeated reliance on private planes. The story refused to die down, fueled not only by the press, but by the anger and amusement of a public eager for scandal. Every new report of Harry's temper added oxygen to the fire, painting him as increasingly unhinged and disconnected. What made the public perception so devastating was that it touched on Harry's deepest vulnerability. He had always wanted to be seen as different from the rest of the royal family, as someone who understood ordinary people, who cared about veterans not as pawns, but as brothers and sisters in arms. Now, in the eyes of many, he was no different from the royals he had criticized. Just another privileged figure demanding more than his share. The anger he displayed behind closed doors became, in the public imagination, symbolic of his entire downfall. For all the noise generated by the media, for all the sound bites from commentators, and the mockery on social platforms, the voices that mattered most in the Invictus Games scandal belonged to the veterans. They were the heart of the games, the very reason the event existed. Without them, there would be no competitions, no inspiring stories, no mission to rally behind. And so when the dispute over Harry's private jet erupted, their perspective became the most powerful element of the narrative. The veterans were not a monolithic group. Their reactions were as varied as their backgrounds. Some stood firmly by Harry, arguing that his presence was vital to the games and that ensuring his safety and comfort was a necessary investment. Others, however, expressed disappointment, even anger, at what they saw as a betrayal of the values Invictus was meant to embody. The contrast between these perspectives revealed the depth of the crisis Harry faced. For those veterans who supported him, the argument was simple. Without Harry, the games would not exist. He was the visionary who took inspiration from the Warrior Games and built it into an international movement. He was the figure who used his royal name to draw attention and resources. For them, the request for a private jet seemed reasonable given his global profile. They pointed out that Harry lived under constant threat, that he had been the target of relentless media harassment, and that security concerns were not hypothetical. If ensuring his safety required private air travel, then so be it. To these veterans, Harry was still one of them, a soldier who had worn the uniform, walked on deployments, and shared in the hardships of military life. They viewed the criticism as unfair, even cruel, given the pressures he faced. But not all veterans felt the same. For many, the private jet request struck a nerve. It symbolized the very gap between leaders and those they claimed to represent, a gap veterans knew all too well from their time in service. These were men and women who had endured bureaucracy, who had been made to feel disposable after returning from war, who had fought for recognition and care. To see Harry, their founder, demanding luxuries that no veteran would ever receive felt deeply out of touch. One veteran from the UK, who had lost a leg in Afghanistan, spoke candidly in an interview. "When we come to the games, we fly economy. We deal with delays, wheelchairs not fitting in the aisles, the stares of passengers who don't understand. And we don't complain, because this is about resilience, about proving we can still fight." If Harry can't do the same without a private jet, then what does that say about his message? These words cut through the noise, resonating with the public in a way no tabloid headline could. They captured the essence of the betrayal many veterans felt. Another veteran from Canada shared a more personal reflection. He described his excitement at competing in Toronto in 2017, the pride he felt representing his country, and the gratitude he had toward Harry for creating the platform. But he admitted that the jet story left him unsettled. "I owe Harry a lot. Invictus gave me purpose again, but it hurts to think he's forgotten what this is about. We're not here for glamour. We're here to show we're not broken. I just hope he remembers that." The disappointment in his voice echoed the feelings of many competitors who feared that Harry's actions could overshadow their stories. What made the veterans' voices so significant was that they spoke from experience. They were not commentators speculating from afar. They were living the very values Invictus was supposed to represent. Their criticisms carried moral weight. When they expressed disappointment, it was not rooted in malice or politics, but in a deep sense of betrayal. They had embraced Harry as one of their own, a man who understood their struggles. To see him demand privileges they could never dream of having was a painful reminder that perhaps he was still different after all. The veterans' reactions also highlighted a growing divide between Harry's original vision and the direction the games seemed to be heading. In the early years, Harry was seen hugging competitors, listening to their stories, walking alongside them without barriers. He was authentic, approachable, and grounded. But over time, as his life with Meghan became more curated, more controlled, and more steeped in luxury, veterans began to sense a distance. The jet request confirmed those fears. It made them question whether the founder who had once embodied humility was still the same man. Some veterans went further, warning that the scandal could damage the games themselves. Donors, sponsors, and governments might hesitate to contribute if they believed the funds were being diverted to serve Harry's lifestyle. One veteran from Australia was blunt. "If this becomes about Harry instead of us, the games will lose everything that made them special." His words reflected a deep fear that the event would shift from a platform of resilience to a spectacle of entitlement. Yet amid the disappointment, there were also calls for balance. A group of veterans defended Harry passionately, reminding critics that he had risked his life in service and that he continued to dedicate his time to supporting them. They argued that the media was twisting the story, turning a security concern into a scandal for clicks and ratings. "Harry's done more for us than any politician," one American veteran said. "If he needs a jet to get here safely, then give him the damn jet." The games aren't about how he travels. They're about what we do when we get there. These defenders saw the controversy as a distraction from the athletes' real stories. The division among veterans reflected a broader truth. Harry's actions had fractured the unity that once defined Invictus. Where once there was only admiration, now there was debate. Where once Harry's role was unquestioned, now it was scrutinized. The veterans' voices amplified this shift, bringing authenticity to a narrative that might otherwise have been dismissed as tabloid exaggeration. Perhaps the most poignant reflection came from a British veteran who had competed in multiple games. He described his journey of recovery, the pride of wearing his uniform again, and the joy of competing on the world stage. But when asked about the jet story, his words were measured and heavy. "Invictus is about being unconquered, about showing the world that scars don't define us. I worry that if Harry forgets that, the games will lose their soul." These words underscored the stakes of the controversy. For veterans, Invictus was not just an event. It was a lifeline, a community, a chance to reclaim identity. If its founders' actions undermined its core values, then the damage would not just be to Harry's reputation, but to the very heart of the movement. The decision by the Invictus Games CEO to deny Prince Harry's private jet request did not happen in a vacuum. Behind the scenes, the boardroom was a pressure cooker of competing priorities, financial constraints, security concerns, and public perception. To understand the magnitude of this decision and the ripple effect it would have, one must step into the quiet, tense corridors of leadership where every choice could ignite controversy. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and apprehension. The CEO, a veteran administrator with years of experience in international sporting events, had been fielding requests and emails for weeks. Harry's team had sent multiple communications, each more urgent than the last. They emphasized security risks, the unpredictability of commercial flights, and the need for discretion. But every request came with implications that could not be ignored. Financially, a private jet was a significant burden. The Games, while well-funded through sponsorships and donations, operated on a careful budget designed to maximize support for the veterans. Every dollar spent on luxury or convenience for any individual risked drawing criticism and scrutiny. Board members debated long into the night, weighing the moral and practical consequences. Some argued that Harry's status and his role in attracting media attention justified the expense. Others countered that allocating funds to a single individual could undermine the trust of sponsors and the very participants the games were meant to serve. Security was another critical concern. The CEO had consulted extensively with advisors on risk assessment. Harry's profile, while drawing global attention, also carried extraordinary risk. Threats were real, from both obsessive media attention and the more nefarious elements that occasionally targeted high-profile figures. The CEO knew that denying the jet request could provoke anger, but approving it could invite even more scrutiny and complicate security logistics. Every potential outcome had to be calculated with precision. Boardroom discussions were not purely analytical. They were intensely human. There were moments of tension where voices were raised, moments of hesitation as members considered the political ramifications, and moments of quiet reflection as the gravity of the situation settled in. One board member reportedly leaned back in their chair, sighing deeply, and said, "We cannot let the games become about one person. It's about all of them, the athletes, the veterans, the stories we showcase. If we lose sight of that, everything else fails." This statement struck a chord with the CEO, reinforcing the difficult position they were in. The decision would not just be about Prince Harry. It would be about maintaining the integrity of the games. The CEO recalled past controversies, times when the games had been criticized for perceived elitism or mismanagement. Each incident had been a learning experience, a reminder that visibility came with responsibility. Denying the jet, while risky, could be framed as a principled stance rooted in fairness and accountability. The boardroom also had to contend with external pressures. Media outlets had begun sniffing around the story, sensing a potential scandal that could drive clicks and headlines. Advisors warned that any decision would inevitably be leaked or misinterpreted, transforming a logistical matter into a public spectacle. The CEO was acutely aware that whatever they chose, Harry's global platform and the media's appetite for sensational stories would magnify the consequences. Adding another layer of complexity was the dynamic between Harry and the CEO personally. In the early days of the games, there had been mutual respect and admiration. Harry had been approachable, passionate, and engaged in every aspect of the event. But over time, as the games grew and as Harry's public profile shifted, tension had emerged. The CEO had grown increasingly cautious, concerned about precedent, public perception, and the need to maintain organizational integrity. Denying the jet request, though fraught, had become a statement of principle, a boundary-setting move that reaffirmed the mission of the games. The conversation also touched on logistical challenges beyond finance and security. A private jet meant coordinating airspace permissions, ensuring crew availability, and preparing for contingencies that could disrupt the game's schedule. The CEO and their team had to think like military planners, mapping out every possible scenario from technical malfunctions to potential media intrusion. Each added complication increased the weight of the decision, reinforcing that this was not merely a matter of convenience, but a strategic choice with operational consequences. The boardroom debate extended into the realm of optics and public trust. Approving Harry's request could trigger perceptions of elitism and favoritism. Denying it risked public backlash from royal supporters and Harry's fan base. Every board member weighed these outcomes, considering the delicate balance between ethics, loyalty, and accountability. The discussions were long, exhaustive, and emotionally charged. There were no easy answers, no perfect solutions, only a series of choices with consequences that would unfold in real time. Ultimately, the CEO made the call. After hours of deliberation, consultation with security advisors, financial analysis, and weighing the voices of both veterans and board members, the decision was clear. The private jet request would be denied. It was a choice grounded in principle, one meant to protect the integrity of the games and the trust of the athletes. It was also a decision that would spark immediate tension, a confrontation that neither the CEO nor Harry could have fully anticipated. When the news reached Harry, the reaction was immediate and intense. His team expressed shock, disbelief, and frustration. Emails turned into phone calls, and phone calls escalated into urgent messages marked with exclamation points and bold warnings. The denial, meant as a professional, principled stance, became a flashpoint for emotions that had been simmering for months. Harry felt blindsided, his sense of entitlement and his need for security colliding with the reality of organizational limits. The CEO, meanwhile, braced for the fallout. They understood the magnitude of the confrontation to come, aware that they were about to face one of the most influential and scrutinized figures in the world. This was not just a professional challenge. It was a test of leadership under extraordinary pressure. How one navigated this moment would define reputations, relationships, and potentially the legacy of the games themselves. The tension between personal expectation and organizational principle would soon play out in public, igniting media coverage, stirring social media debate, and drawing in voices from around the globe. The story of the private jet request became more than logistics. It was about power, responsibility, and the collision between celebrity influence and the mission of a movement dedicated to resilience and recovery. As the chapter of boardroom decisions closed, it left behind a volatile mix of anticipation, anger, and uncertainty. The denial had been a clear statement, yet it set in motion a chain of events that would test loyalties, challenge perceptions, and bring the human side of the games into sharp, dramatic relief. What had seemed like a routine operational decision was now the catalyst for a story that would unfold in ways no one could fully predict. The moment the denial of Prince Harry's private jet request became official, the ripple effects started immediately. It was not just a matter of logistics anymore. It had transformed into a story of pride, frustration, and very public tension. Harry, known for his passion and intensity, did not take the refusal lightly. Behind the polished exterior of royal composure, emotions ran high, and private conversations became heated confrontations that would soon spill into wider circles. In the days following the denial, the palace received a flurry of communications from Harry's aides. Messages, emails, and phone calls pressed urgency, repeating arguments about safety, convenience, and the precedent set by the logistics of hosting such a high-profile event. The CEO, however, remained steadfast, balancing the emotional weight of the confrontation with the practicalities and principles that guided the games. This stalemate set the stage for tension that was as personal as it was professional. As news began to leak, journalists with inside sources sensed the drama simmering behind closed doors. Headlines appeared online within hours, each one hinting at a royal confrontation without revealing details. Speculation spread rapidly. How would Harry react publicly? Would he withdraw from the games entirely? Could this conflict escalate into a scandal that overshadowed the athletes and the purpose of the event itself? Media outlets, accustomed to covering royal affairs, quickly amplified the story, framing it as a clash between privilege and principle. Social media was even faster and less forgiving. Fans and critics alike weighed in with opinions, memes, and heated debates. Some portrayed Harry as a figure unfairly restricted, denied the comfort and safety that his status warranted. Others painted him as overstepping boundaries, prioritizing personal convenience over the collective mission of the games. Hashtags began trending, debates unfolded on platforms around the world, and the private jet issue became a public spectacle within hours. Within Harry's inner circle, the denial sparked intense conversations about strategy, optics, and public image. Advisors debated whether to escalate, seek a compromise, or quietly accept the decision. Each choice carried risk. Escalating the situation could be seen as entitlement or arrogance, while quietly accepting the denial could signal weakness or retreat. The stakes were not just operational. They were reputational, with long-term implications for how Harry would be perceived in both royal and public spheres. Meanwhile, the CEO prepared for the inevitable confrontation, anticipating how Harry might react in person. Security teams were briefed on possible scenarios, media teams on potential leaks, and staff on managing public perception. Every member of the board understood that a high-profile clash was no longer theoretical, it was imminent. The atmosphere within the organization grew tense, with whispers in hallways and cautious glances exchanged between departments. When the first face-to-face meeting finally occurred, the tension was palpable. Harry arrived, a mixture of controlled composure and barely restrained frustration visible in his demeanor. The CEO, calm and measured, presented the reasoning behind the decision once again, emphasizing fairness, budgetary constraints, and the broader mission of the games. What followed was a delicate dance of words, emotion, and diplomacy. Harry's voice carried urgency, his arguments impassioned and persuasive, appealing to both logic and the weight of his personal experience. The CEO responded with equal firmness, rooted in principle and responsibility. Observers described the encounter as electric, each word laden with meaning, every pause pregnant with potential escalation. It was a clash not just of personalities, but of philosophies, one rooted in celebrity, personal safety, and influence, the other grounded in organizational integrity, collective responsibility, and ethical stewardship. Neither side could claim victory easily, and both emerged from the meeting with a sense of unresolved tension. The fallout extended beyond the individuals directly involved. Sponsors, partners, and veterans associated with the games began expressing concern, some privately, others through public statements. The delicate balance of trust, public perception, and operational excellence was now under scrutiny. Questions arose. Would the game's mission be compromised? Could this conflict overshadow the achievements of the athletes? Were the organizers prepared for the reputational risk inherent in a public dispute with royalty? As the story unfolded, media outlets began digging deeper, uncovering past incidents that added context and color. Analysts highlighted previous disagreements between Harry and organizational leadership, drawing connections that suggested a pattern of friction. Royal commentators speculated about potential interventions from the palace, while veteran advocates expressed concern that personal disputes could distract from the purpose of the games. Every new piece of information added fuel to the fire, intensifying public interest and magnifying the stakes. For Harry, the situation became increasingly personal. The private jet, while ostensibly a logistical concern, symbolized much more: respect, consideration, and acknowledgement of his role. Denial of that request was interpreted as a slight, challenging his authority and influence. Emotional reactions began to intertwine with professional decisions, creating a volatile mix that would define his approach to the games in the weeks to come. Behind the scenes, allies and advisors strategized on damage control, attempting to navigate the narrative in a way that protected both Harry's image and the integrity of the games. Every message, every public appearance, and every statement was scrutinized, calculated for maximum impact. They weighed the balance between defending Harry's position and avoiding escalation that could harm the event or the athletes themselves. Public reactions only intensified the pressure. Social media debates became heated, with passionate supporters on both sides framing the issue in starkly opposing terms. Headlines emphasized conflict, controversy, and emotion, often prioritizing drama over nuance. Within hours, what began as a logistical denial had evolved into a narrative of confrontation, power, and principle that captivated global audiences. In the midst of this whirlwind, the CEO and their team remained focused on the mission. They reiterated their commitment to the athletes, to the fairness of the games, and to upholding principles over celebrity demands. The clash with Harry, while dramatic, was framed internally as a reminder of the game's core values: integrity, inclusivity, and the unwavering focus on those the event was meant to serve. The denial of the private jet request and the fallout that followed ultimately highlighted a fundamental tension: the intersection of personal status and institutional responsibility. It raised difficult questions about how high-profile individuals interact with organizations, the limits of influence, and the balance between accommodation and accountability. The story was no longer about convenience or luxury. It was about power, principle, and the human emotions that complicate every organizational decision. Almost immediately after the news of Prince Harry's denied private jet request began to leak, the media frenzy escalated into a full-blown storm. News outlets across the globe seized on the story, blending verified facts with speculation, interviews, and insider whispers. Headlines ranged from subtle curiosity-driven teasers to sensational proclamations of royal outrage, capturing the attention of millions within hours. Prince Harry denied luxury transport at Invictus Games, screamed one, while another suggested, royal rift exposed. Harry faces humiliation as CEO says no. Social media, predictably, became an accelerant, spreading the story with memes, hot takes, and hashtags, drawing both supporters and critics into a heated debate. For Harry, the media storm was both a relief and a pressure point. On one hand, it amplified his perceived grievance, giving his position visibility beyond the private walls of the game's administration. On the other, it magnified every emotional reaction, scrutinized every word, and amplified criticism from every angle. Public opinion was divided sharply. Some saw him as standing up against bureaucracy, fighting for his comfort, security, and the respect owed to his status. Others framed the narrative as entitlement, privilege, and a lack of understanding of the game's mission. Questions circulated widely. Why was a private jet request even considered? Did Harry expect special treatment? And, crucially, what did this say about his commitment to the athletes and their experience at the Games? The story quickly evolved into a narrative far larger than the original denial. Analysts dissected the event through multiple lenses: royal tradition, celebrity influence, organizational fairness, and even public relations strategy. Pundits debated whether Harry's reaction could overshadow the games themselves, potentially diverting attention from the athletes' achievements. Experts in media and communications weighed in, suggesting that the story was likely to remain in the public eye until a resolution emerged, and that each public statement, each image of Harry at the Games, would be examined in light of this controversy. Social media added layers of immediacy and unpredictability. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook were flooded with commentary ranging from outrage to empathy, with fans taking sides passionately. Memes began circulating depicting Harry's reaction in exaggerated terms, some sympathetic, others mocking. Video clips of past Invictus Games events were reshared with commentary comparing logistics, accommodations, and transportation arrangements for previous royals and dignitaries. Every element of the story, no matter how minor, became fodder for public discussion and online debate. Journalists, eager for exclusives, sought insider accounts. Anonymous sources hinted at tense private meetings, emotional confrontations, and strategic disagreements, adding color and drama to the narrative. One report suggested that Harry had contacted several high-profile allies to weigh in on his behalf, while another hinted that the CEO had prepared contingency plans in anticipation of Harry's potential withdrawal from the event. Each leak, each hint, amplified the perception of a brewing showdown, creating suspense for audiences worldwide. Traditional media, social media, and public commentary did not exist in isolation. They influenced each other, creating feedback loops that intensified the narrative. News outlets reported on social media trends, while social media users reacted to the coverage, amplifying spikes in engagement and sentiment. For Harry, every post, every article, every discussion became part of a living, breathing narrative over which he had limited control. The very public nature of the dispute turned a logistical issue into a symbolic debate about privilege, influence, and personal boundaries. Even within the game's community, reactions were mixed. Athletes, staff, and volunteers observed the controversy with a mix of curiosity, concern, and exasperation. Some expressed empathy, acknowledging the pressures Harry faced in balancing personal expectations with public responsibilities. Others worried that the dispute could overshadow the purpose of the Games, divert attention from athletic achievements, and the broader message of resilience, camaraderie, and healing that the event embodied. Internal communications reflected a delicate balancing act, supporting the organization's leadership while navigating the complex web of public sentiment. Political commentators also weighed in, framing the event as a microcosm of broader societal tensions around wealth, privilege, and entitlement. Debates surfaced on news panels, podcasts, and online forums about whether public figures with extraordinary resources should be subject to the same constraints as organizations and institutions, or whether their status inherently entitled them to accommodations. These conversations extended far beyond the private jet itself, touching on ethics, responsibility, and leadership under public scrutiny. For Harry, the intense spotlight produced an emotional maelstrom. Private advisors worked tirelessly to manage narrative risks, coordinate media statements, and guide responses. Each decision had to balance empathy with authority, diplomacy with conviction, and public perception with personal satisfaction. The strain was compounded by the awareness that any misstep could be magnified, potentially shaping the public's understanding of his character and priorities for years to come. Amid the media storm, narratives began to crystallize into two dominant interpretations: Harry as the wronged royal standing firm against bureaucracy, or Harry as a figure out of touch, demanding special treatment at the expense of the game's mission. Each interpretation carried reputational implications, influencing public attitudes, media framing, and the expectations of both allies and critics. Analysts noted that the framing of this story had the potential to shape perceptions not just of Harry, but of the games themselves, potentially affecting sponsorships, viewership, and organizational credibility. The situation also prompted broader reflection among royal observers and historians. Discussions emerged about precedent. How had previous members of the royal family navigated similar logistical conflicts? How did public perception influence decisions about privileges, accommodations, and expectations? These historical comparisons added context, underscoring that the denial of the private jet request was not merely about a single decision, but was connected to long-standing tensions between personal status, public duty, and organizational fairness. As the media storm raged, Harry's own communication strategy became increasingly vital. Carefully crafted public statements, selective interviews, and controlled appearances were designed to assert his perspective while minimizing escalation. Yet, even the most deliberate efforts could be reframed, repurposed, or distorted in the whirlwind of public commentary. Every action required foresight, anticipation, and a keen understanding of the narrative currents shaping global perceptions. By the end of the first week, the story had taken on a life of its own. The private jet denial had evolved from a logistical disagreement into a symbol of tension between celebrity and institutional responsibility, a narrative ripe with emotion, controversy, and public intrigue. For audiences, the story provided a window into the high-stakes world of royalty, celebrity, and global events, revealing the human drama behind logistical decisions and the emotional resonance of perceived slights and refusals. Behind the public headlines and media speculation, another layer of tension simmered quietly but intensely within the royal family itself. News of Prince Harry's private jet request denial and the ensuing media storm had reached Buckingham Palace, Sandringham, and other royal residences, setting off a chain reaction of concern, private discussions, and strategic evaluations. The royal household, while accustomed to public scrutiny, recognized immediately that this particular incident had the potential to affect not only Harry's reputation but the broader image of the monarchy at a critical juncture. Initial reactions within the family were varied. Some senior members reportedly viewed the situation with a mixture of disbelief and dismay, questioning why Harry had insisted on such accommodations when the games were fundamentally about the athletes, resilience, and rehabilitation rather than personal privilege. Insiders suggested that King Charles and Prince William engaged in private conversations, seeking to understand the full scope of events before issuing any public statements. They reportedly discussed the potential consequences for the monarchy's image, weighing whether intervention or mediation would be necessary. The Duke of Cambridge, according to sources, expressed concern that the narrative could overshadow the games themselves. He reportedly said, in private discussions with advisors and family members, that the focus should remain on the athletes and the inspirational message of the event, rather than on disputes over luxury transport. His position reflected a broader understanding that the monarchy's credibility relies heavily on public perception and the careful balance between tradition, duty, and visibility. Other members of the family had more empathetic responses toward Harry. They reportedly recognized the pressures he faced in navigating personal expectations, security requirements, and the intense media spotlight. These family members acknowledged that while the request for a private jet might seem extravagant or controversial, it also stemmed from the unique challenges Harry faced as a royal navigating high-profile public events. Internal discussions highlighted the complexity of the situation, balancing public opinion with private realities, and weighing empathy against protocol. Advisors within the royal household played a crucial role in these discussions. Experienced courtiers and communication strategists reportedly briefed the family on potential media outcomes, suggested approaches for managing the story, and provided counsel on how to respond, or whether to respond at all. These advisors were acutely aware that any misstep could exacerbate the controversy, inflame public opinion, or generate further headlines. Their guidance emphasized discretion, measured communication, and the need to maintain the dignity of the monarchy while addressing the unfolding situation. At the same time, there were indications of private tensions between Harry and certain family members. Sources suggested that some felt his insistence on a private jet, coupled with his public expressions of frustration, risked portraying the family in a negative light. Private discussions reportedly included debates about the balance between supporting Harry as a family member and safeguarding the institution's broader image. Questions arose. Could Harry's dissatisfaction be addressed internally without fueling the media frenzy? Would a direct intervention from the palace exacerbate tensions further? The Queen's senior aides reportedly monitored the situation closely, assessing whether formal guidance or subtle intervention was necessary. While the monarch herself was not expected to make a direct public statement, her influence through trusted advisors was understood to be significant. The palace reportedly considered options ranging from behind-the-scenes mediation to carefully crafted public messaging that could help recalibrate the narrative, protect Harry's reputation, and reinforce the focus on the Invictus Games mission. Family members were also reportedly concerned about the potential long-term impact on Harry's relationship with other royals. The dispute over the private jet, amplified by global media coverage, was seen as a stress test for family dynamics. Courtiers noted that how Harry handled the public fallout, how other family members responded privately, and how communication flowed between key players could influence not only the immediate situation but also future interactions, collaborations, and perceptions of loyalty, solidarity, and understanding within the royal household. Throughout this period, private communications between Harry and select family members reportedly continued, sometimes tense, sometimes conciliatory. Messages emphasized both emotional support and pragmatic advice, with reminders of the importance of maintaining focus on the athletes, the games, and the broader message of service and leadership. Despite disagreements and underlying frustrations, these exchanges highlighted an ongoing effort to manage relationships, protect personal and institutional interests, and navigate the intersection of personal desire and public duty. By midweek, the royal family had reportedly reached a tentative consensus on how to approach the situation externally. Courtiers and communications advisors recommended limited statements emphasizing Harry's commitment to the Invictus Games, his support for the athletes, and the organization's dedication to delivering a world-class event. These statements aimed to defuse media speculation, restore focus to the event's purpose, and subtly mitigate the narrative of personal conflict without publicly criticizing or undermining Harry. Despite careful planning, the family recognized that Harry's emotional response and the global media attention made total control impossible. Analysts and advisors noted that public perception would be shaped as much by Harry's actions and statements as by official communications. The royal family understood that Harry's engagement, his visible demeanor at the games, and the unfolding interactions with staff, organizers, and the public would significantly influence how audiences interpreted the story, making each moment a high-stakes opportunity to convey composure, leadership, and commitment. Amid these internal deliberations, discussions also touched on the broader symbolic implications of the incident. Observers noted that the dispute highlighted ongoing tensions between traditional royal expectations and the modern realities faced by high-profile family members. The episode was interpreted as a case study in how privilege, responsibility, and personal desire can collide, creating complex dynamics that ripple across public perception, media narratives, and institutional credibility. Sources within the family emphasized that the focus remained on maintaining unity, protecting reputations, and ensuring that the Invictus Games themselves were not compromised by personal disagreements. Strategic planning reportedly included guidance for Harry on public appearances, media interactions, and private meetings with key organizers, all designed to balance assertiveness with diplomacy and personal preference with institutional expectations. The royal family's careful management of the situation was complicated by the continuous media scrutiny and social media discourse. Every movement, every statement, and every interaction was analyzed, interpreted, and debated across multiple platforms. Advisors worked tirelessly to anticipate outcomes, mitigate potential missteps, and preserve both Harry's dignity and the broader credibility of the monarchy. The delicate dance between family dynamics, personal expectations, and public image became an intricate narrative unfolding in real time for millions of observers worldwide. As news of Prince Harry's denied private jet requests spread, the world seemed to erupt overnight. Headlines screamed with variations of the same provocative story. Prince Harry denied jet at Invictus Games, royal rift exposed amid Invictus Games preparations, and Duke of Sussex furious after private jet rejection. The coverage was relentless, spanning newspapers, online outlets, television broadcasts, and social media platforms, each adding its own layer of interpretation, speculation, and sensationalism. Media outlets, ever hungry for drama, framed the incident through multiple lenses. Some emphasized the clash of personalities, portraying Harry as frustrated and entitled, while others leaned into narratives of a misunderstood royal, caught between public duty and personal needs. Analysts debated the optics endlessly. Was this an isolated dispute or a symptom of deeper tensions within the royal family? What did this reveal about the modern monarchy and the balance between privilege and protocol? Public interest skyrocketed, and the story quickly became a trending topic globally. Social media amplified the frenzy exponentially. Twitter threads dissected every known detail, TikTok videos offered dramatized retellings, and Instagram posts circulated quotes, screenshots, and speculative commentary. Hashtags related to the incident began trending, with millions of impressions across multiple platforms. Users debated fiercely, some sympathizing with Harry's position, highlighting his dedication to the Invictus Games and the athletes' welfare, others criticizing the request as emblematic of royal extravagance. The digital conversation became an intricate tapestry of opinion, gossip, and outrage, blurring the lines between fact and interpretation. Mainstream news programs fueled the intensity. Pundits and commentators dissected the situation from morning to evening, offering analyses that ranged from the empathetic to the critical. Experts in royal affairs speculated about the potential consequences for Harry's public image and the monarchy as a whole, noting that even minor incidents involving high-profile royals could spiral into international controversies. Each segment framed the story with urgency, highlighting the contrast between Harry's demands and the principles of the Invictus Games, which centered on resilience, teamwork, and the rehabilitation of wounded veterans. International reactions added another dimension. Media outlets in Europe, North America, and Australia reported with keen interest, drawing connections to Harry's previous public disputes and his well-documented tensions with the royal family. Columnists examined the broader implications, suggesting that the incident could influence public perception of the monarchy, affect charitable partnerships, and even impact Harry's own initiatives and engagements. Diplomatic observers speculated quietly about the subtle message sent to institutions and organizations affiliated with the royals, noting that perception often carried as much weight as reality in high-profile controversies. Celebrity commentary fueled the fire further. Public figures and influencers offered their takes on Harry's frustration, his insistence on the private jet, and the broader narrative of privilege and public expectation. Some praised Harry for standing his ground, framing his position as an act of advocacy for comfort, safety, and efficiency amid a demanding schedule. Others ridiculed the request, portraying it as a demonstration of entitlement inconsistent with the values of the event. Each opinion, shared widely online, added to the maelstrom of discussion, keeping the story in the public eye around the clock. The media frenzy extended to investigative reporting, with journalists attempting to uncover the logistics behind the denied request. Reports explored why the Invictus Games CEO had refused the private jet, citing organizational priorities, budget constraints, and security protocols. Analysts drew attention to the operational complexity of arranging transport for high-profile attendees and the importance of maintaining focus on the game's primary mission rather than personal convenience. Some sources suggested that while Harry's request was reasonable in certain contexts, the timing and communication style had contributed to the refusal, offering a nuanced perspective amid the sensational headlines. News outlets also examined historical context, referencing previous instances where royals' travel requests had sparked controversy. Comparisons were drawn between Harry and other family members, assessing patterns of behavior, public reception, and media scrutiny. These contextual analyses offered audiences a deeper understanding of the interplay between expectation, protocol, and public perception, framing the current incident as part of a broader continuum of royal visibility and accountability. Meanwhile, public engagement reached unprecedented levels. Online polls, comment sections, and social media debates allowed everyday users to weigh in, often with intense passion. Supporters lauded Harry's commitment to attending the games, emphasizing the importance of comfort and safety for someone carrying the weight of his responsibilities. Critics highlighted the potential optics problem, questioning whether personal preference should supersede the event's logistical and financial considerations. This groundswell of public commentary created a feedback loop, influencing media framing and further intensifying coverage. Some media outlets took a more investigative approach, contacting former staff, royal insiders, and event organizers for behind-the-scenes insight. Quotes from anonymous sources hinted at private tensions, internal disagreements, and the balancing act required to satisfy a high-profile attendee while ensuring the games ran smoothly. Experts in event management discussed the unique challenges posed by royals and celebrities, noting that requests for private travel were not uncommon, but required careful negotiation to align with organizational priorities and public expectations. Amid this media storm, the Invictus Games themselves became a focal point of public discussion. Audiences expressed concern that the athletes, the very people the games were meant to celebrate, might be overshadowed by controversy surrounding one individual. Commentators questioned whether the focus on Harry's private jet request detracted from stories of resilience, courage, and triumph that the games traditionally highlighted. This tension between individual prominence and collective mission created a layered narrative, further complicating public perception and media coverage. The international media frenzy also prompted a reaction from advocacy groups and charities associated with the games. Representatives emphasized the importance of maintaining attention on athletes and veterans rather than personal disputes. Press statements were carefully worded, reaffirming support for Harry's contributions while reinforcing the organization's commitment to mission-driven priorities. These statements sought to navigate a fine line, acknowledging a high-profile participant's presence and importance without exacerbating the controversy or creating an impression of favoritism. While the world watched the media frenzy unfold with fascination, inside the private chambers of royal advisors, intense discussions were taking place. These meetings were far removed from public scrutiny, yet the decisions made here would ripple outward, influencing public perception, internal dynamics, and the unfolding narrative of Prince Harry's conflict with the Invictus Games leadership. Royal aides, seasoned in managing both the optics and substance of high-profile controversies, were grappling with a delicate balancing act, defending a prominent family member while maintaining the integrity and mission of the monarchy. Advisors convened in dimly lit conference rooms, reviewing communications, schedules, and the escalating coverage in real time. Each team member brought a unique perspective. Some focused on public relations, others on security, protocol, or the potential diplomatic consequences. The tension was palpable. Even the most experienced courtiers were acutely aware that missteps could quickly become international headlines, magnifying any minor miscommunication or perceived slight into a full-blown scandal. One aide reportedly remarked, "Every word we issue will be dissected, every action scrutinized. We have to anticipate the spin before it happens." The discussions revealed a spectrum of opinions on how to manage Harry's frustration over the private jet denial. Some advisors advocated a hands-off approach, suggesting that allowing Harry to express his dissatisfaction privately could prevent further public spectacle. Others urged proactive engagement, crafting statements or controlled disclosures to reassure the public and mitigate reputational risk. The debates were long, intricate, and emotionally charged, reflecting the high stakes involved. The monarchy's image, Harry's personal satisfaction, and the cohesion of the royal family were all intertwined in a complex web of influence and expectation. At the center of these deliberations was the fundamental question: how should the monarchy respond to a highly visible figure publicly experiencing frustration over logistical limitations? Protocol traditionally emphasized discretion, understatement, and respect for institutional norms. Yet Harry's position as a former senior royal, combined with his continued global visibility, complicated the traditional playbook. Advisors weighed whether bending to his preferences might set an undesirable precedent or whether adhering strictly to policy risked alienating him further, potentially inviting media criticism or public backlash. The dynamics within the advisory team mirrored the broader tensions in the royal household. Long-standing relationships, trust, and loyalty were tested in these closed-door meetings. Sources suggest that private conversations with Harry were tense, occasionally punctuated by frustration on both sides. He reportedly expressed feeling misunderstood and undervalued, citing his contributions to charitable work, advocacy, and public engagement. Advisors, in turn, emphasized the importance of maintaining consistency, fairness, and the values of the institution, reminding him that the game's purpose extended far beyond individual convenience. Confidential memos circulated among key figures, outlining potential strategies to address the incident. These included options ranging from private apologies or concessions to strategic public messaging reinforcing Harry's role while highlighting the organization's operational constraints. Each approach carried its own risks. Granting concessions might appease Harry but could trigger criticism from media or the public, painting him as entitled. Conversely, rigid adherence to protocol could exacerbate his frustration and create internal tension, risking further leaks or negative commentary. The decisions were not merely logistical, they were deeply symbolic, reflecting the balance of power, perception, and familial relationships. Security considerations added another layer of complexity. Royal security officers monitored the situation closely, assessing risks to Harry and other attendees if tensions escalated. The potential for protests, paparazzi intrusion, or unexpected confrontations required detailed contingency planning. Every movement, every decision about transport, lodging, and itinerary had to account for safety while respecting privacy. Advisors had to weigh these operational realities against Harry's expressed desire for convenience and autonomy, creating a constant tension between protection, protocol, and personal preference. The closed-door deliberations also included discussions about messaging control. How could the advisors frame the story if asked directly by the press? What narratives would be endorsed, and which would be quietly denied? Some proposed subtle statements highlighting Harry's commitment to the games and the athletes, presenting his frustration as a testament to his dedication. Others cautioned against overexposure, arguing that drawing attention to the denied request could overshadow the athletes and the purpose of the event itself. Every word, every nuance, became a calculated decision designed to influence perception without inflaming the situation further. In the background, the royal family's inner circle monitored Harry's private communications and social media activity. Advisors were attuned to subtle shifts in tone, language, or emphasis that might hint at further escalation. Analysts examined the timing of public appearances, interviews, and charitable engagements, searching for patterns that could signal growing dissatisfaction or strategic positioning. These insights informed decisions about whether to engage directly with Harry, adjust schedules, or issue carefully worded statements to preempt further controversy. Interestingly, these private discussions revealed a deeper emotional undercurrent. Beyond logistics, protocol, and public image, there was genuine concern for Harry's well-being. Advisors recognized the stress of constant scrutiny, the emotional toll of balancing personal desires with institutional expectations, and the potential for misunderstandings to escalate unnecessarily. Some reportedly expressed empathy, acknowledging that denial of a private jet might seem trivial in isolation, but could feel like a broader lack of respect or appreciation for someone of Harry's stature. The interplay between emotion, duty, and strategy created a highly charged environment, where every decision carried both practical and symbolic weight. Sources indicate that at times, informal channels, texts, phone calls, and personal meetings were preferred over formal communication. Advisors sought to maintain direct access to Harry, believing that private dialogue might prevent leaks or misunderstandings from reaching the press. These interactions, however, were not always smooth. Reports suggest occasional clashes, with Harry expressing frustration at perceived inflexibility, while advisors stressed the importance of maintaining standards and respecting the game's mission. This push-and-pull dynamic revealed the delicate balancing act of serving both individual needs and institutional obligations simultaneously. The chapter of private discussions also highlighted differences in perspective among the advisors themselves. Veteran aides, with decades of experience navigating royal controversies, emphasized caution, understatement, and strategic patience. Newer team members, more attuned to the immediacy of media and social engagement, advocated for transparency, engagement, and proactive narrative control. These generational and experiential differences fueled internal debates, shaping the approach to both Harry and the broader public. By the time the discussions concluded, a strategy began to crystallize. Advisors agreed on a measured approach, combining private engagement with Harry, reinforcement of institutional values, and careful public communication designed to reassure stakeholders without inflaming tensions. Security plans were reviewed and updated, media monitoring continued, and contingency measures for potential escalation were established. It was a meticulous orchestration, reflecting the high stakes of navigating a high-profile royal dispute in a global spotlight. Despite the resolution of these internal discussions, a sense of unease lingered. Advisors knew that while private strategies could mitigate immediate risks, the unpredictable nature of media, public opinion, and Harry's own responses could create new challenges at any moment. The intersection of personality, privilege, and protocol was inherently volatile, and every action or inaction had the potential to reshape perception, influence public sentiment, and impact the monarchy's reputation. As news of Prince Harry's denied private jet request began to circulate, the story quickly exploded across global media outlets, social media platforms, and celebrity news cycles. What began as a logistical disagreement within the Invictus Games organization became a public spectacle, sparking intense debate, speculation, and criticism. Headlines ranging from sympathetic to sensational flooded the internet. Some portrayed Harry as a dedicated advocate thwarted by bureaucracy, while others labeled him entitled, expecting preferential treatment despite the event's focus on athletes and charitable missions. Within hours, news aggregators were flooded with articles, opinion pieces, and viral posts dissecting every known detail. Royal correspondents and pundits offered their analysis on live television, radio shows, and online forums, dissecting the implications of a former senior royal publicly expressing frustration over operational constraints. Experts weighed in on the optics, debating how this incident might influence Harry's public image, his relationship with the royal family, and even future engagement with charitable organizations. One commentator remarked, "This is a perfect storm, a private dispute turned public spectacle. How Harry navigates this will have long-term implications for his credibility and influence." Social media, of course, amplified the story exponentially. Platforms such as Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok became arenas of heated debate, where users expressed a broad spectrum of opinions. Some defended Harry, citing his relentless advocacy for veterans, mental health initiatives, and charitable work. Others mocked his response, suggesting that no individual, regardless of status, should expect personal accommodations at a large-scale international event. Hashtags surged, trending globally, and short-form video commentary from influencers dissected Harry's demeanor, previous public controversies, and the potential fallout from the denied jet request. Every tweet, post, and video clip added layers to the evolving narrative, shaping public perception in real time. Within this whirlwind of attention, newspapers and digital publications also sought context, revisiting Harry's history of interactions with institutions, charities, and event organizers. Stories emerged highlighting previous instances where he had voiced dissatisfaction or disagreed with organizational decisions, providing a narrative through-line that journalists could trace. Headlines such as Harry versus Protocol, another royal clash, and From Prince to Protest. Harry's battles with bureaucracy dominated search engines, contributing to an air of inevitability that this latest dispute would escalate beyond the private sphere. Media outlets also explored the broader implications for the Invictus Games themselves. Interviews with former participants, organizers, and sports journalists highlighted the delicate balance between honoring veterans, coordinating global logistics, and managing the expectations of high-profile attendees. Many emphasized that while the denied jet request was a logistical decision, the ensuing media storm risked overshadowing the athletes' achievements, the purpose of the Games, and the charitable impact the event was designed to have. This tension between the personal desires of a royal figure and the mission of a global charity became a central theme in ongoing reporting. Public sentiment, as reflected in opinion polls and social media engagement metrics, was sharply divided. Some sympathized with Harry, framing his frustration as a reflection of his commitment to attend in style and comfort while ensuring maximum visibility for his advocacy work. Others criticized what they perceived as entitlement, questioning whether a public figure should expect private luxury at a charitable event. Editorial boards debated whether the incident revealed a deeper pattern of prioritizing personal convenience over organizational integrity, or whether it was a minor squabble blown out of proportion by global media attention. Celebrity commentators and former royals added further dimension to the discourse. Interviews with public figures sympathetic to Harry suggested that he faced immense pressure to maintain visibility and influence while balancing family dynamics and public expectations. Conversely, some critics drew parallels with other royal disputes, arguing that public outrage often amplifies behavior that might otherwise remain private. The multiplicity of perspectives created a narrative rich with tension, nuance, and complexity, reinforcing the story's emotional and informational depth. The media frenzy did not only involve coverage of Harry's request, but also extended to speculation about the broader royal family's response. Analysts discussed whether this incident would trigger private interventions, formal statements, or strategic public appearances designed to manage perception. Rumors circulated about back-channel communications, internal debates, and potential concessions, each claim magnifying public curiosity and fueling online chatter. The story became a mirror reflecting societal fascination with royalty, celebrity, and the intersection of personal desire and public duty. As the coverage intensified, even minor details, such as the timing of Harry's travel arrangements, his interactions with Invictus organizers, and previous media appearances, were scrutinized and dissected. Pundits offered minute-by-minute analyses, creating a sense of immediacy and urgency that captivated audiences worldwide. This relentless attention transformed the denied jet request from a logistical dispute into a cultural event, with layers of narrative extending beyond Harry himself to questions about power, privilege, and responsibility in modern royalty. Interestingly, the frenzy also sparked discussions about the role of media ethics. Opinion writers and journalism experts debated whether reporting on the incident served the public interest or simply catered to voyeuristic tendencies. Was highlighting a denied jet request and Harry's reaction newsworthy, or was it sensationalism at its finest? These conversations, while peripheral to the immediate story, underscored the broader societal dynamics at play. The public's insatiable curiosity for behind-the-scenes royal developments and the media's willingness to feed that curiosity for engagement, clicks, and revenue. Amid this swirling coverage, public engagement manifested in unexpected ways. Memes, parody accounts, and humorous videos proliferated, blending satire with social commentary. Online communities dissected the narrative, theorized about possible outcomes, and even created polls asking viewers whether Harry's frustration was justified. This layer of participatory storytelling amplified the narrative, turning passive audiences into active participants in shaping the story's trajectory. While public discourse raged online and in print, the immediate consequences for Harry were both tangible and symbolic. Invitations, appearances, and sponsorships were analyzed for potential impact. Every decision, from media interviews to social media posts, became a strategic move in a larger chess game where public opinion, family dynamics, and personal reputation intersected. Sources suggest that Harry's team monitored the coverage closely, adjusting messaging and engagement strategies to navigate the increasingly complex landscape of public perception. This chapter of public outcry and media frenzy demonstrates how a seemingly straightforward dispute, a denied private jet request, can evolve into a global spectacle. It underscores the intersection of personal desire, organizational logistics, media amplification, and public perception. Every reaction, whether from journalists, commentators, or social media users, contributed to a multi-layered narrative rich in tension, emotion, and insight. While the media frenzy painted a vivid picture for the public, behind the polished headlines and viral tweets, a far more intricate and tense drama was unfolding away from cameras and microphones. Within conference rooms, private offices, and encrypted messaging threads, Prince Harry, his aides, and the Invictus Games executive team engaged in a high-stakes negotiation that would determine not only Harry's travel arrangements, but also the tone and perception of the entire upcoming event. Sources familiar with the discussions reveal that the Invictus Games CEO approached the situation with meticulous planning, fully aware of the potential complications that accommodating a royal request could entail. The logistics of arranging a private jet for a high-profile attendee were far from simple. Beyond the mechanics of scheduling and flight clearance, there were considerations of security, insurance, and coordination with local authorities at the game's host city. Every step had to balance the safety and comfort of Harry with the broader mission of the games, honoring athletes and veterans without letting a single individual's personal demands overshadow the event. From Harry's perspective, the request was straightforward. Years of attending, supporting, and promoting the Invictus Games had established certain expectations. He envisioned a seamless travel experience that would allow him to focus entirely on his role as advocate and ambassador, without the distraction of logistical hurdles. A private jet was more than a convenience. It was a tool to maintain privacy, ensure punctuality, and project an image of influence befitting a former senior royal. However, this request collided with a reality far less accommodating. Initial communications were polite, professional, and measured. Emails exchanged between Harry's team and the Invictus organizers outlined the technical details, flight requirements, and scheduling preferences. Yet, as discussions progressed, the tone shifted. Harry's aides, frustrated by what they perceived as bureaucratic roadblocks, escalated requests, emphasizing the necessity of private air travel for security and efficiency. Meanwhile, the Invictus CEO maintained a firm stance, citing organizational policy, fairness to other guests, and logistical constraints that could not be compromised. Multiple confidential sources describe moments of tension during video conferences. Voices reportedly rose, with Harry expressing disbelief that a former CEO's decision could prevent him from accessing a service that, in his view, was standard for someone of his profile. The Invictus CEO, equally resolute, stressed that no exceptions could undermine the integrity of the games or the equitable treatment of participants. "We respect his contributions," one source quoted, "but we cannot bend rules for one person, regardless of title or celebrity." The back-and-forth negotiations stretched over days, involving repeated calls, text messages, and private meetings. Advisors on both sides weighed the ramifications of each concession or refusal. For Harry, conceding risked diminishing his authority and public image. For the Invictus team, yielding could set a precedent, triggering similar demands from other high-profile attendees in future events. Each decision carried layers of consequence, practical, symbolic, and reputational. Security considerations further complicated matters. The risk profile of flying a high-profile individual on private transport required coordination with intelligence and protective services. Flight paths had to be vetted, airspace clearance obtained, and ground operations synchronized with local security forces. These requirements were standard protocol but added layers of delay and scrutiny, fueling frustration on both sides. Harry's aides argued that alternative arrangements could be made, but the CEO and logistical teams emphasized that flexibility was limited. In parallel, informal channels buzzed with speculation and updates. Whispers circulated among royal staff, charity insiders, and event planners, each conversation adding nuance, exaggeration, or interpretation. Harry reportedly voiced exasperation at what he described as unnecessary hurdles, while the Invictus CEO reiterated that organizational rules could not be compromised for even the highest-profile participant. Observers note that the tension extended beyond a mere logistical disagreement. It became a clash of expectations, authority, and the differing perspectives of public figure versus event organizer. Advisors on both sides carefully documented each interaction. Emails were drafted and revised multiple times, highlighting the need to maintain professional decorum while asserting critical points. Harry's communications stressed urgency, highlighting his commitment to veterans and athletes and framing private air travel as essential to fulfilling these obligations. The CEO's responses, in contrast, emphasized policy adherence, fairness, and the broader impact of granting exceptions. This careful but tense dance highlighted the competing priorities of personal convenience, organizational integrity, and public perception. Additionally, this private struggle was complicated by the presence of the media. While discussions were confidential, insiders understood that leaks were inevitable. Every phrase, email, and text could be picked up by journalists eager for a scoop. As a result, communications were crafted with dual considerations: practical problem-solving and narrative control. Harry's team was acutely aware that the framing of their requests could influence public sentiment. The Invictus team understood that maintaining credibility required unwavering adherence to policy, regardless of media fallout. The negotiations reached moments of standstill, with neither side willing to yield. Sources report heated exchanges where Harry questioned the rationale behind refusal, citing his history with the games and personal sacrifices. In turn, the CEO outlined previous instances where exceptions had been denied, emphasizing the importance of equitable treatment for all participants. These exchanges, though conducted professionally, were charged with emotion, reflecting the high stakes and personal investment on both sides. Ultimately, the behind-the-scenes narrative reveals the complexity of managing high-profile individuals within charitable organizations. The intersection of personal expectation, public duty, logistical reality, and media scrutiny created a multidimensional challenge. Both parties navigated a delicate balance, seeking solutions that addressed practical needs while preserving dignity, mission focus, and public perception. As the private negotiations between Prince Harry and the Invictus Games CEO reached their most tense moments, the story began to leak to the public. Initially, it was subtle: whispers in royal circles, off-the-record comments to journalists, and small social media hints that something was amiss. But once the narrative hit mainstream outlets, it exploded into a full-blown media frenzy, capturing global attention almost overnight. News outlets ran headlines questioning why the former royal would be denied a private jet, framing the story in ways that ignited debate. Some portrayed Harry as a frustrated advocate, unfairly blocked from fulfilling his commitments to the games. Others criticized him, depicting a man whose sense of entitlement clashed with organizational rules designed for fairness. The polarized coverage intensified public scrutiny as viewers worldwide took sides, commenting on forums, tweeting opinions, and sharing sensationalized versions of the unfolding events. Social media became a battlefield. Memes circulated that exaggerated Harry's frustration, while commentators dissected every statement, tweet, or public appearance linked to the Invictus Games. Hashtags supporting and criticizing him trended globally, creating an almost immediate feedback loop that influenced both public perception and the internal strategies of the parties involved. Advisors on both sides monitored the digital landscape carefully, understanding that each viral post had the potential to escalate tensions or shape negotiation tactics. For Harry, the media exposure was a double-edged sword. On one hand, public empathy and support could strengthen his position, pressuring the Invictus organizers to accommodate his requests. On the other, the risk of appearing demanding, entitled, or unprofessional loomed large, threatening to overshadow his long-standing work with veterans. Each news segment, each headline, became a calculated risk. The prince's team scrambled to issue clarifying statements, emphasizing dedication to the games and the athletes, while downplaying any personal dissatisfaction. The Invictus Games team faced a parallel challenge. They had to respond to the narrative carefully, preserving the integrity of the organization while avoiding unnecessary escalation. Every press release, interview, or comment needed precision, balancing firmness with diplomacy. The CEO's public statements highlighted adherence to policy, fairness to all participants, and commitment to the mission of the games. Yet behind these calm words lay the tension of knowing that any perceived inflexibility could be weaponized in the media, portraying the organization as obstructive or insensitive. Journalists dug into every angle. Historical precedents of high-profile guests being accommodated were examined, sometimes drawing unfair comparisons. Reporters questioned the financial and security implications of granting Harry's request, analyzing budget reports, flight logs, and event schedules. Expert commentators weighed in, offering opinions on protocol, royal influence, and organizational leadership. The coverage became increasingly layered, blending fact, speculation, and commentary in a complex web that was difficult for the public to parse accurately. The human element of the story fueled its appeal. Audiences were drawn to the emotional undertones. The frustration of a former royal denied a long-standing request, the stress of managing a world-class charitable event, and the delicate interplay of ego, expectation, and responsibility. Media narratives often emphasize these emotional beats, describing meetings as heated or tense, amplifying the drama and engagement. Interviews with insiders, anonymous sources, and former employees added color and context, painting a picture of conflict that was both personal and public. Public reaction varied widely. Supporters of Harry framed the denial as an unnecessary obstacle to his charitable mission, sharing stories of his contributions to the games and the sacrifices he had made over the years. Critics questioned whether a private jet was essential or appropriate, suggesting that the request highlighted a disconnect between personal privilege and organizational fairness. Discussion threads online reflected a blend of admiration, criticism, curiosity, and outrage, creating a dynamic, evolving narrative that the mainstream media continued to amplify. The role of social media influencers further magnified the situation. Viral videos, opinion pieces, and commentary streams dissected every possible angle, sometimes exaggerating minor details for dramatic effect. The story became a cultural moment, referenced in late-night shows, talk radio, and international news cycles. The public, though distant from the actual negotiations, became active participants, reacting emotionally, forming opinions, and driving discourse that influenced perception far beyond the initial logistical conflict. As the media coverage intensified, so too did the pressure on both Harry and the Invictus Games organization. Advisors counseled strategic communication, careful management of appearances, and controlled messaging. Every public appearance, photo opportunity, and statement had to be meticulously planned. The narrative could shift in an instant with a single tweet or leaked email, and both sides recognized that perception was as important as reality in shaping public opinion. By the end of this phase, the story had evolved far beyond a simple logistical disagreement. It had become a lens through which the world examined power, privilege, fairness, and personal expectation. The private jet request, initially a practical matter, symbolized broader tensions between individual influence and organizational rules, between public persona and private need, and between the expectations of a former royal and the mission of an international charitable institution. As the news of Prince Harry's denied private jet request swept across headlines and social media, the royal family could no longer remain silent. Traditionally, the palace maintains a careful balance of discretion and public engagement, but this situation demanded attention, not only because of Harry's high profile, but also due to the growing media storm surrounding the Invictus Games. The denial of the jet, the media frenzy, and Harry's escalating frustration had created a story that threatened to reflect poorly on the monarchy itself, raising questions about influence, entitlement, and family dynamics. The palace communications team convened urgently, analyzing the implications of public sentiment, potential reputational damage, and the need to maintain neutrality while addressing the story. Advisors highlighted the delicate line between supporting a former royal's charitable endeavors and avoiding preferential treatment that could undermine the principles of fairness and transparency. Each word in any statement was scrutinized, and multiple drafts were prepared before any official communication could be released. Inside Buckingham Palace, discussions among senior family members were intense. Sources indicate that King Charles personally reviewed the situation, weighing Harry's history with the Invictus Games, his dedication to veterans, and the optics of the denied request. While Harry's past contributions were acknowledged and celebrated privately, there was also recognition that repeated requests for special privileges could create a perception of entitlement, which the palace could not afford publicly. The balance between familial loyalty and institutional integrity was at the heart of these deliberations. Queen Consort Camilla reportedly expressed concern about the growing media attention, emphasizing the importance of controlling the narrative to prevent speculation from spiraling further. She urged caution, suggesting that any direct engagement with the story should reinforce the monarchy's dedication to charitable causes while highlighting that all guests, regardless of status, were expected to adhere to organizational policies. Her perspective reflected a strategic approach, recognizing that in today's media environment, even a minor misstep could lead to viral criticism or long-lasting reputational consequences.